Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're diving into something that's, honestly, surprisingly revealing. We're going to explore how literature, pop culture, and historical fiction act as a remarkably precise mirror for the evolution of American public ethics. We often think of ethics as these dry, rigid rules written in some dusty textbook. But today, we'll see how our favorite stories, our biggest scandals, and our most enduring myths actually map out the moral landscape of the nation. It's a fascinating journey, so let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp how deep this goes, we're going to start somewhere you might not expect: Springfield. Yep, the fictional town of The Simpsons brilliantly satirizes our real-world institutional shortcuts. Think about it for a second. You have Mayor Quimby, who literally constantly places his own personal convenience way ahead of municipal responsibility. You have Police Chief Wiggum, who treats official shortcuts as just, well, part of the daily routine. Then there's Mr. Burns, the incredibly powerful business owner who completely expects public institutions to serve him and his bottom line. And right in the middle of all this is Homer, whose everyday consumption and, let's be honest, total avoidance of responsibility add this highly relatable everyday dimension to the whole shebang. It's a comedy, for sure, but it kind of forces us to ask, is Springfield actually America's truest ethical mirror?
Section 1, Satire and Self-Interested Honesty. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the writer James Ellroy argues that American ethical complexities were basically baked in from the very beginning. Actually, scratch that idea that America started in some state of complete moral innocence and only later declined into corruption. Ellroy says that's just not the case. Look at Benjamin Franklin. He viewed honesty not just as some abstract moral good, but as a highly practical, measurable business asset. In Franklin's view, a merchant who's reliable gains credit, trust, and future income. It's a model of self-interested honesty. Being good is literally good for business. And look at how perfectly this maps onto modern tech philanthropy. When wealthy founders, folks like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, redirect massive resources through charitable foundations, they're participating in this exact same continuing tradition. It's this incredibly complex relationship where reputation, public benefit, massive private wealth, and institutional influence are just deeply, inextricably tied together. Section 2, the price of legislation.
All right, we are now escalating the stakes. We're moving away from individual business ethics and zooming up to the actual commodification of national politics. Like, what happens when the government itself becomes a marketplace? To understand that, we turn to the legendary Mark Twain and his novel, The Gilded Age. Twain was a super sharp observer of his time, and he closely watched the infamous credit mobilier scandal of the late 1860s. He took the atmosphere of that massive railroad scandal and dropped it directly into his fiction. He created characters like Duff Brown, who was closely based on the real-life railroad contractor and congressman Oakes Ames. Through this story, Twain showed the public just how deeply government contracts, congressional appropriations, and private business interests overlapped. They overlapped so closely, in fact, that public decisions suddenly acquired an unofficial but very real price tag. And what Twain's satire reveals is that securing a major appropriation meant handing out payments or favors to key committee members. But here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. Legislative influence wasn't portrayed as some shocking, unimaginable crime. No way. It was treated as a routine line item on a budget. It was just an expected business cost. When you look at the mutual dependence between modern contractors, lobbyists, and office holders today, it's pretty clear that this dynamic from the 1860s has very direct, recognizable modern parallels. It's like history repeating itself right in front of us.
Section 3, Protecting the Inside. Let's shift our narrative focus here from politicians to law enforcement. What happens when colleagues construct an institutional shield to protect one another from outside scrutiny? Well, institutional misconduct becomes incredibly difficult to uproot. We see this vividly in the story of New York police officer Frank Serpico. Serpico famously challenged the concealed improper payments happening right inside his own department. His decision to break that intense internal code of silence and testify led directly to the creation of the Knapp Commission, and his story became so culturally significant it was turned into a famous book and film. So, the crucial point is how the resulting Knapp Commission categorized the problem. They realized they had to separate the officers into two distinct groups: passive recipients, those who merely accepted small benefits like free meals or minor gifts, and active participants, those who are actively working with major criminal organizations to protect illegal activity. Why does this matter? Because you simply cannot fix both with the same tool. Isolated acceptance of gifts and the organized protection of illegal activity require entirely different forms of oversight and institutional reform. It's a real night and day difference.
Section 4. Rationalizing Ambition and Power.
Okay, let's move from the mechanics of corruption into the psychology behind it. In the late 19th century, ideas of social Darwinism and Herbert Spencer's intense focus on individual struggle were literally everywhere. The author Theodore Dreiser captured this ruthless atmosphere perfectly in novels like The Titan and The Financier. Dreiser followed powerful figures modeled on real American political and financial operators. Take his character, Frank Cowperwood, largely based on Charles Tyson Yerkes and his cutthroat efforts to control Chicago's streetcar system. What makes Dreiser's characters so fascinating is their mindset. They viewed questionable gains not as moments for deep moral reflection or guilt, but as ordinary, completely expected outcomes of competition. It was just how the game was played. Let's move to and see how this builds by breaking down Robert Penn Warren's masterpiece, All the King's Men. We follow Willie Stark, who transforms from an honest local treasurer into a highly effective but deeply ethically compromised governor. How on earth does he justify his actions? Well, the novel gives us three clear rationalizations. First, governing elites create justifications for reciprocal favors because it sustains their own authority. Second, Stark views compromise not as a sin, but as the unavoidable, necessary material for making actual progress. You basically have to get your hands dirty to build useful institutions. And third, he exploits the vulnerability of supposedly upright people, assuming everyone has a price or a secret, just like Judge Montague Irwin, who is ultimately found to have accepted a bribe. Now, this complex ethical web isn't just confined to politics. It's the very fabric of the modern city. Authors like John Dos Passos in Manhattan Transfer and later Tom Wolfe in A Man in Full depict metropolitan life as a dense, chaotic interaction of money, ambition, personal loyalty, media, and institutional power. Dos Passos actually incorporated real newspaper headlines and advertisements directly into his narrative. It's a brilliant, vivid way to highlight just how deeply media influence dictates the ethical reality of the city. It's all connected. Section 5. Global Reach and Secrecy. We are now escalating our narrative to its final macro stage, the transition from local institutional corruption to global American power and secrecy. At the center of this shift is the Central Intelligence Agency. Established in 1947 to succeed the OSS, the CIA was tasked with conducting intelligence and counterintelligence abroad. During the Cold War, it supported aligned governments and actively worked against unfriendly ones. But this required using covert methods that existed entirely outside ordinary public scrutiny. This created a massive ethical tension, a constant, ongoing clash between the agency's secretive methods and the legislators and presidents who constantly sought to place limits on its immense authority. The historical novelist Gore Vidal visually maps this out for us in books like Empire and the Golden Age. We see the timeline of the nation's massive transition from a continental republic to a vast global power. It starts with the 1898 Spanish-American War and the acquisition of influence in places like the Philippines, marking the official end of American isolationism. It then sweeps right through World War II and into the Cold War. The United States completely rewrote its ethical responsibilities on the world stage during this time. And this brilliantly illustrates the differing reactions to this brand new empire. Gore Vidal uses real historical figures to show these clashing viewpoints. You have the writer Henry James offering a sharp critique of expansion. You have Henry Adams representing the older, more cautious Republican traditions. Theodore Roosevelt embodies the raw, assertive push for national power. And crucially, you have William Randolph Hearst representing the immense ability of mass media to unilaterally shape both public morality and public enthusiasm for this global reach. Which brings us to our final thought. When Theodore Dreiser wrote his stories, he stated he wanted to show the social and psychological conditions behind serious wrongdoing, rather than just deliver a simple moral lesson. But this leaves us with a profound challenge. Does describing the conditions behind misconduct explain it or excuse it? As we've seen from the fictional streets of Springfield to the covert operations of the Cold War, understanding the root of our American ethical landscape is a wildly complex journey. I leave you to ponder. Is understanding our history the same as forgiving it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions and keep exploring.